Hello, dear YouTube viewers. I hope you're doing well. Let's start our video. The year was sometime in the 1880s, and the little frontier town of Dry Creek lay tucked between stretches of endless desert and low, dusty mountains. The sun was sinking, painting the sky a deep blood red, and the air carried the mingled smells of whiskey, sweat, and horse leather. Wooden sidewalks creaked under the weight of boots, swinging saloon doors slapped in the wind, and somewhere a dog barked at nothing in particular. It was market night, a tradition the town didn't speak of in polite conversation, where debts were settled, in the form of women being sold as temporary or permanent brides. Men gathered in the open, voices loud and rough, while women kept to the shadows, watching but not daring to speak. Through this scene came Eli Carter, moving with the slow, steady gait of a man who'd seen enough of life to never rush. He was in his late 30s, his face rugged and weathered from sun and wind, the kind of face that told stories without words. His skin was burnt from years on the trail, a revolver hung at his hip, but his hands rested loose and calm. People in towns like Dry Creek whispered about him, a drifter, quiet as the grave, with the look of a man who'd once been feared. Some claimed he was a gunslinger, though no one could say for sure. Tonight, he was here for one reason only. He'd heard of a young woman named Clara May, and something in the name had pulled him like a memory. If she was who he thought, she might be the daughter of a man Eli had once called a friend. The saloon was thick with the stench of beer and unwashed bodies. Sheriff Briggs stood at the center of it all, a broad man with a gut that spoke of indulgence and a face that wore a constant, oily smirk. He pretended to be a man of the law, but everyone knew the kind of law he served, his own. Tonight, he was the auctioneer, waving a set of papers like a preacher holding scripture, calling out debts and settlements, as if what he was doing was righteous. Then she appeared, Clara May. She was barely 18, dressed in a thin white gown that looked more like a cruel joke than bridal attire. Under the lamplight, she seemed almost translucent, her pale face framed by loose strands of hair, her eyes wide but guarded. There was a stiffness in her posture, as though she was holding herself together by sheer will. Her hands trembled where they clutched the hem of her dress, but she stood tall enough to meet the eyes of the men who looked her over. The crowd reacted as expected. Men leaned forward with hungry grins, whispering crude remarks to each other. Some laughed openly, others stared with cold calculation. A few women in the corners turned away, unable or unwilling to watch. The sheriff's voice rang out, calling for bids. The numbers rose slowly, reluctant offers of $1, then $1.50. There wasn't much appetite to spend more, not when the sheriff would likely put another girl on the block next week. That was when Eli stepped forward. He didn't look at the crowd or the sheriff, just at Clara. His voice was calm, steady, and carried over the room. $3. The saloon fell silent for a moment. Then a few low chuckles rippled through the air. The sheriff's smirk widened. $3 it is, he said, and with exaggerated ceremony, he took Eli's coins and scrawled a signature across the papers. The deed was done. As Clara stepped down, she glanced at Eli with guarded eyes. In her mind, there was no question why he'd bought her. Men only ever bought women here for one reason. Whatever the price, the cost was always the same. Eli guided Clara out of the saloon, his hand lightly gripping her arm, not tight enough to hurt, just enough to steer her through the crowd. He said nothing as they stepped into the cooler night air, only glancing down the street toward the boarding house run by Ma Perkins. Behind them, voices murmured in low, knowing tones. A few men chuckled crudely, making wagers about how long she'd last. Clara kept her head bowed, her stomach churning as though she'd swallowed stones. She didn't dare meet anyone's eyes. She knew what they saw when they looked at her, a prize just bought and paid for. The boarding house was quiet, the lamplight from its front window spilling onto the wooden porch. Inside, Ma Perkins barely glanced up from her desk when Eli nodded to her. She seemed to understand without words, simply handing him a brass key before returning to her ledger. The room upstairs was small but tidy, smelling faintly of soap. A narrow bed sat against one wall, a wash basin with a chipped pitcher beside it, and a single window opened onto the deserted main street. When the door closed, Clara's body tensed. Her pulse quickened. Her hands curled into fists at her sides. She had been in rooms like this before. Rooms where doors closed and things happened whether she wanted them to or not. She braced herself for the weight of his hands, the sound of a belt buckle, the start of something she couldn't stop. Instead, Eli took off his hat and set it on the small table. Then he did something she didn't expect at all. He knelt down in front of her, not to touch her, but to look her in the eyes. His voice was low and steady. "I'm not here to hurt you," he said. "You're safe tonight." Her throat tightened. "Then why did you buy me?" she asked, the words unsteady. "Because your father once saved my life," Eli answered. "I owed him more than $3. Something inside her cracked at those words. The tension that had been holding her upright gave way, and a sound tore from her throat. Not a cry of fear, but the kind of scream that came from years of being shown nothing but cruelty, only to be met, suddenly, with unexpected kindness. She stumbled back onto the bed and broke down, sobbing into her hands. Eli didn't come closer. He simply sat in the lone chair, waiting quietly, letting her breathe and cry until the storm passed. When she could finally speak again, he told her the truth. He had known her father, Samuel May, long before that night, the night the fire took her parents. He had been with Samuel the evening before it happened, sharing whiskey and old stories. But he'd left for another town before dawn, never knowing it would be the last time he saw his friend alive. By the time he returned, Samuel was dead, Clara was missing, and the town was full of rumors. Since then, Eli had been chasing whispers, hearing her name spoken in dusty towns, learning she had been passed from one household to another, treated not as a person, but as payment for debts. Clara told him her side. The sheriff had claimed her father owed money, more than he could ever repay. After Samuel's death, Briggs forged papers to make the debt hers, declaring she would work it off however he saw fit. For years she'd endured threats, leers, and hands that grabbed without permission. She had been bartered like cattle, told each time it was the last, until this night, when the auction was supposed to settle the final balance. She finished her story with her eyes fixed on the floor, as though afraid to see pity in his. Eli didn't speak right away, but when he did, his voice was firm, leaving no room for doubt. Not anymore. In the smoky haze of the saloon, Sheriff Briggs leaned back in his chair, nursing a glass of cheap whiskey. The night had worn thin, and most of the patrons had either stumbled home or fallen asleep at their tables. That was when one of his deputies, already too far gone in drink, leaned in close and muttered something that made Briggs' eyes narrow. Clara May, the girl sold to Eli Carter for $3, had not spent the night properly with him. At first, Briggs laughed, thinking it a joke, but when the deputy swore it was true, his smile hardened into a scowl. Pride and money were the only two things the sheriff valued, and this insult touched both. If word spread that a man could walk away from the bargain without collecting what he'd paid for, other buyers might hesitate next time. His little side business depended on fear, on certainty, on the idea that once bought, a woman belonged to her purchaser without question. This was bad for business. Briggs set down his glass and leaned forward, his voice dropping to a dangerous growl. "If Carter thinks he can cheat me, he's got another thing coming." He decided he'd take Clara back, make it look legal, claim the contract had been broken. The townsfolk wouldn't dare question him. Hours later, the quiet of the boarding house was broken by a sharp knock. Eli opened the door to find Ma Perkins standing there, her hair wrapped in a kerchief, her expression tense. She glanced down the hall before stepping inside and closing the door behind her. "Briggs has been flapping his jaws in the saloon," she said in a low voice. "He's sending his boys after you. Says you broke the deal." She reached into the folds of her apron and pulled out a cloth bundle. "Bread, jerky, and a flask. Won't last you long, but it'll get you through a few days." Eli took the bundle without a word, his jaw tight. Ma Perkins looked him straight in the eye. "Best you ride before the sun comes up. Briggs doesn't like being made a fool of." In the small adjoining room, Clara lay awake, the thin blanket pulled to her chin. Through the wall she could hear their voices, low and urgent. Ma's warning was clear enough, but it was Eli's silence that stirred unease in her chest. She thought of all the men she'd known before, how they always started with a soft word and a promise, only to reveal, in time, the same hunger as the rest. What if Eli was no different? What if, when the running got hard, he decided she was worth more as a bargaining chip than as a person? She pushed the thought away, but it clung stubbornly, like burrs in her mind. She sat up, ready to gather her things and slip away before dawn. But then she heard Eli's voice, firm and unshakable. "I'd sooner take a bullet than let Briggs lay a hand on her again." The words froze her in place. She sat back down on the bed, her heart pounding, not with fear this time, but with something she hadn't felt in years. Hope. The first light of dawn spilled across Dry Creek, washing the main street in a pale silver glow. The town still slept, but Eli was already moving in the shadows, saddling 2 horses in the alley behind the boarding house. The leather creaked softly under his hands, and his every movement was careful, deliberate, quiet enough not to stir the wrong ears. A soft shuffle of footsteps made him glance up. Clara stood there, her thin shawl wrapped tight against the morning chill. She hesitated in the half-light, eyes darting toward the still dark windows of the town. For a moment, he thought she might turn back, but then she stepped forward, climbing onto the second horse, without a word. They slipped onto the street, hooves muffled in the dust. For a few precious seconds, the world was silent except for the steady rhythm of their riding. Then a sharp voice shattered the calm. From the stable doorway, a boy no older than 12 had spotted them. "Sheriff, they're leaving," he yelled. The call echoed through the sleeping town like a gunshot. By the time the sun's edge crested the horizon, Sheriff Briggs and 3 of his deputies were in the saddle, tearing after them. Dust rose in great plumes behind the riders, the sound of pounding hooves growing sharper with every heartbeat. Eli pushed the pace, guiding Clara through a maze of narrow arroyos where the sandstone walls closed in tight, forcing their pursuers to slow. From there, they cut across the open scrubland, weaving between clusters of mesquite, heading for the Redwater River, the border that would put them beyond the sheriff's jurisdiction. But the river was swollen from days of heavy rain, its muddy waters raging high against the banks. They had no choice. To stay on their side meant capture. Eli urged his horse forward, the animal plunging into the current. Clara followed, her mare fighting the pull of the water. Halfway across, her horse stumbled, its legs sinking into a deep hole in the riverbed. Clara pitched forward, a cry tearing from her lips as the current grabbed at her skirts. Before she could be swept away, Eli was there, throwing himself from his saddle and grabbing her arm. The cold water slammed into them both, dragging at their clothes, but he held on, hauling her toward the far bank. They tumbled onto the mud, soaked and breathless. Clara's chest heaved as she looked at him, really looked at him for the first time. His shirt clung to his skin, revealing a web of old scars across his chest and ribs, pale against the tanned flesh. They weren't the kind of marks a man got from an accident. These were bullet wounds, each one a story he carried with him. In that moment, she understood. Eli had been living with danger for a long time, maybe his whole life. And yet, here he was, risking it again. For her. The canyon walls rose steep and sheer on either side, the morning sun cutting the pass into sharp contrasts of blinding light and deep shadow. Eli rode hard, knowing that once they made it through, the trail would split into a dozen narrow tracks, enough to lose their pursuers for good. But the sound of hooves behind them told him they wouldn't make it that far unchallenged. They reached the midpoint of the pass when Sheriff Briggs appeared, blocking the way with 2 deputies, flanking him. The sheriff's face was red with anger, his horse shifting under the tension in his grip. Eli reined in, his own horse snorting clouds of breath in the cool canyon air. Clara's mount sidled nervously beside him. The canyon fell silent except for the creak of leather and the distant rush of the river they'd just crossed. Briggs's voice carried, sharp and commanding. "Step aside, Carter. She's mine." Eli's gaze didn't waver. "She's no man's but her own." The words hung in the air, the kind of statement that made tempers flare in men like Briggs. The sheriff's mouth twisted into something between a sneer and a grin. "Big talk from a drifter. Nobody's gonna take your word over mine. I've got papers saying she's property. You've got nothing, but dust on your boots. Eli leaned forward slightly in the saddle. Well, you've got to forge debts and a business built on selling women who never owed you a cent. Briggs barked a laugh, but it rang hollow in the still canyon. You think anyone in Dry Creek cares about that? You think they'll believe you over their sheriff? It was Clara's voice that broke the standoff's rhythm. Trembling but clear, she spoke from where she sat, her hands tight on the reins. They don't have to believe him. They can believe me. She took a breath and kept going, her words steadying with each sentence. She told them of the false debt, the years of being passed around as payment, the threats, the auction. Her voice echoed against the canyon walls, carrying the weight of truth. Briggs's jaw tightened. He shifted in his saddle, the sneer gone now, replaced with calculation. Then, quick as a striking snake, his hand went for his gun. But Clara was quicker. Scooping a handful of wet river mud from the bank they'd passed moments earlier, she flung it straight into his face. Briggs cursed, blinded, his hand faltering. That single beat was all Eli needed. His revolver cleared leather in one smooth motion, the report cracking like thunder between the canyon walls. The shot struck Briggs's pistol, sending it spinning from his grasp to clatter against the rocks. The sheriff's horse shied, nearly unseating him, while the deputies exchanged uncertain glances, their hands drifting away from their own weapons. The canyon was suddenly still again, but the balance of power had shifted. The canyon felt different now, less like a trap and more like a doorway to something bigger. Briggs sat on the ground, wrists bound with a length of Eli's lariat, still muttering under his breath. His face was streaked with dried mud, and his eyes carried the look of a man who finally understood he'd lost. Eli stood over him, revolver holstered, voice calm but cold. Circuit Judge will be through here in 2 days. You'll have plenty of time to think about what you've done before you stand in front of him. The two deputies shifted uncomfortably. Neither met Eli's eyes. Without a word, they mounted their horses and turned back toward town, their spines bent as though the canyon itself were pressing them down. When the echoes of their hoofbeats faded, Eli untied his own horse and turned to Clara. She was still standing where the standoff had ended, her hands trembling just slightly, her gaze fixed not on Briggs, but on the wide-open horizon beyond the pass. "You're free now," Eli said, his tone softer. "Where you go from here, that's up to you." Her eyes flicked to his. "And where would I even go?" He hesitated before answering. "I can take you east. Heard you might have some kin out in Kansas, folks who'd take you in. Or," he looked toward the endless sweep of land ahead, "you can ride with me for a while. No promises, no debts. Just until you decide what you want." Clara didn't answer right away. She stepped a little away from him, breathing in the cool morning air, letting it fill her chest. It felt different, cleaner, lighter. She thought of all the locked rooms, all the nights waiting for footsteps in the dark, all the hands that had reached for her without asking. For the first time, no one was holding her still. Finally, she turned back to Eli. There was the smallest smile at the corner of her mouth. "I think I'll ride." Eli nodded once, almost as if he'd expected it. They mounted up, their horses moving side by side as they left the canyon behind. The sun was climbing higher now, spilling gold over the land. The road ahead was long and uncertain, but they didn't ride as owner and property, or rescuer and rescued. They rode as two people, free, unclaimed, each with their own future to write. Thanks for watching. For more videos, please subscribe. Our channel, American Latest Stories.